when humans were these kind of creatures you were describing, walking around the earth, just like animals with no sense of being, right? And then they are saying that they consumed this mushroom, according to that Netflix series. And this mushroom gave them some sort of sense of being. And this is where consciousness starts. This propels us to learn and to explore and to invent language and to understand that there's a possibility of working together, to have these creative ideas. So first of all, I know this is not scientific by any means, but is this something that might be possible?
So it certainly is possible, or something like that. So what seems to have occurred is it's, as I said, it wasn't selected for because the time period's too short, right? Selection processes take hundreds of thousands of years. They don't happen in the space of a few thousand. So it must have been that, obviously it's an evolutionary process, but it must have been a side effect of evolutionary processes, right? And in fact, it probably wouldn't have been selected for anyway, because it doesn't seem to bestow any evolutionary advantage over the short to medium term, which is what you need, right? Actually, it would seem to be a disadvantage over the short to medium term to be aware of your being, as you said. So it seems some capacity was a side effect of evolution, and then something in the environment triggered that capacity. And that would explain why it happens, in historical terms very quickly, because there must have been something in that region of Africa where people were living that triggered it. And it could be something environmental. Maybe there was something about the weather which triggered certain kinds of crops to behave in a way they hadn't behaved before, which maybe, as you say, perhaps something hallucinogenic or something like that got into the food system. You need something that triggers that capacity. But once it's triggered, then you start to have these new human beings walking the earth, and everything thereafter changes. Fascinating period, though. Imagine, as Chomsky talks about, there will be this period where there are people who have this capacity surrounded by people who don't. You haven't got language yet. I mean, you just imagine.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you're one of these. No one else has it, but you've got it. And you can't have language because language requires a whole bunch of you to have this capacity. So I just think the mind boggles of what that must be like. But yeah, so that something like that is actually quite plausible. It's got to be something environmental, I think, that triggers it, and something like that.
Right now I'm reading a book called The Feeling of Life Itself. One argument mentions that could it be that other people are still not conscious in this world? Like, could it be that some other human beings that are not conscious, or they're not at the level of consciousness that other people are? Is there like variations to how conscious and aware? And is it a skill through meditation and stuff? Could you attain different levels of consciousness? I know this is not the topic of our talk, but this is something that I'm curious about.
So philosophers have talked about that. I mean, just as a what we call thought experiment, this idea of zombies. So by zombie, they don't mean people who are like flesh eating. They mean people that look like us and act like us, but nothing is going on inside. And in a way, some of these, we're thinking, a lot of people are thinking, plugging the AI into like humanoid type, robotic shapes. That would be kind of like a zombie. You can make what looks like a human being. It does all the predictions right. So it can come up with language, it seems. I mean, it's not actually speaking language, of course, because it doesn't. I mean, the machine doesn't understand what it's saying. It's a big crucial difference. But it would look like it understands it, and you could have conversations with it because it would just respond, right? Stimulus response. And so you would have something like zombies around. I mean, they could look just like us, act just like us, but they wouldn't actually be aware of anything. I mean, whether there's any human beings like that, I mean, that seems unlikely. Although, of course, there are certain kinds of human beings that have certain kinds of personality traits, which mean that they're not far off. People with sort of sociopathic type traits and so on, where they just don't care about other beings in the way that we naturally do, and so on. But even there, they're conscious and strategic in their reasoning and so on. It's just that it's kind of misaligned rather than it's not an absence of consciousness. It's kind of like a misaligned sort of consciousness.
Yeah, but how do we know if a robotic who is mimicking being conscious and having a sense of self, how do we know it's not true?
There's an old joke in philosophy, like if something looks like a duck and acts like a duck, well, it's a duck. But like a decoy duck, they use in hunting, is not a duck, right? I mean, it just isn't. Maybe it looks just like one, acts just like one, but it's not actually a duck. So that it's very important to keep on to those distinctions.
So biology for you is very important. Like, is it because we are a biological being?
Yeah, I mean, it's as it were what we call the etiology. It's how our consciousness, the causal backstory, how we came to be what we are, is very important to who we are. And of course, for us, that's a biological one. So I'm not saying you couldn't create conscious beings, but I am very suspicious of the idea that you could just engineer them like machines. I mean, maybe you could train some, like, maybe you could socialize a machine. I don't know, which is because that's what happens to us. There's a socialization component. We become we absorb a worldview, we absorb a way of thinking from our culture, which is embodied in the language. So the biological endowment gives us this capacity for language, but then we also need the socialization. Maybe there's something like that, the embodiment and socialization. You could do that with a silicon-based entity. I mean, I don't know. This is all very science fiction, but the idea that you could just sort of, you could 3D print, as it were, something and then plug in something and then it's suddenly a conscious being. I think that's a mistaken idea of what consciousness is. It's not that kind of thing. But you said about how you can tell. Actually, right now you can tell. Even maybe ChatGPT will get a lot better and so on, but it's very interesting. I mean, ChatGPT is very good at doing quite unsophisticated stuff. So we see it as academics with essays. They can write a C-grade essay for ChatGPT very easily, but it can't do a good essay. They just can't. And in fact, you can spot them. And one thing I say to the students, you're not going to get the AI might help you with your essay, but it's not going to help you get an A because it can't write that kind of essay yet. And that's quite interesting. Why can't it write that kind of essay? Right? I mean, it can read lots of them. There's something about the creativity of that kind of essay that you don't get just with big data and predictions. And in fact, actually, there's other ways you can tell. Chomsky talks about this, like the language. Our language use is so specific. The grammatical rules and the way they manifest themselves in language, that predictive engines, which is what the ChatGPT and so on, they're bound to get certain kinds of sentences wrong because the subtleties will be lost on them. They're not lost on us because, as it were, we're sort of biologically primed to pick up on these subtleties, but the machine doesn't have that. So the machine is just looking at big data and generates predictions and ends up with the wrong prediction. And in fact, tells us something really interesting about language use. We couldn't acquire the language that we acquire through big data. We acquire it by having certain biological endowments, like certain kind of cognitive capacities hardwired in there, which then get socialized, through engagement in the environment. Then we don't, as it were, learn a language. In fact, we don't learn. The first language isn't, strictly speaking, learnt at all. It's absorbed, right? We're primed for it, and we're plugged into an environment that's suited for it, and then boom, it just happens. And you find this with little kids. We talk about teaching little kids a language, but we're kind of teaching them sort of the superficial stuff. Kids just pick it up. I mean, they just absorb it, right? Just by being around, because it's all there. It's all there primed to occur. The machine doesn't have anything like that.